Hey guys, tonight we're heading back, way back, to a time when history wasn't just written. It was carved into stone tablets and whispered around flickering campfires. I want you to imagine the dry, dusty air of a desert. The kind of air that tastes like grit and sun-bleached rock. You're trudging alongside a vast crowd, sandals scuffing against the sand, and the heat of a merciless sun beats down on your neck. This is a journey through a moral desert, a landscape where our ideas of good and evil, hero and villain, become as blurred and shimmering as a mirage on the horizon. You probably won't survive this journey with your simple notions of right and wrong intact. We're going to look at figures you've always seen as giants of history, the good guys, and we're going to squint hard to see the shadows they cast. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're up for it, drop a comment with your location and the time, so we can feel a little more connected across the miles. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Our story, or at least this leg of it, begins with a figure you probably know more from Sunday school stories than from detailed historical accounts, Moses. You picture him, maybe, standing on Mount Sinai, a stern but righteous man with tablets of stone under his arm. The quintessential hero, right? He leads his people out of slavery, parts the Red Sea, and delivers a set of moral commandments that still shape societies today. He's the liberator, the lawgiver, but there's a lesser-known tale, a strange and unsettling one, that reveals the more complex, even paradoxical, nature of his leadership. You're in the desert with the Israelites, and they're complaining, as they so often do, about their miserable conditions. They're thirsty, they're tired, and they've had enough of manna, which, let's be honest, sounds a lot like glorified birdseed. In their frustration, they start to speak against both God and Moses. And here's where things take a turn. The Bible tells us that God sends venomous serpents among the people, and they bite and kill many. It's a pretty harsh punishment for a little complaining. But remember, this is a different moral universe. The people, understandably terrified, repent and beg Moses to intercede. And Moses does, but the solution isn't what you might expect. Instead of just healing everyone with a snap of his fingers, God commands Moses to do something deeply symbolic and a little bit creepy. He tells Moses to fashion a bronze serpent and mount it on a pole. The decree is that anyone who has been bitten can look at this bronze serpent and live. Think about that for a second. The very symbol of their affliction, the serpent, becomes the instrument of their salvation. This wasn't some kind of magical antidote, it was an act of faith. A moment where a person had to face the very thing that was killing him and believe in the promise of a cure. It's a mainstream historical fact, or at least a cornerstone of religious history, that this bronze serpent became a powerful symbol. It later acquired the name Nehushtan. In a quirky tidbit, it was so revered that centuries later, another king had to destroy it because people were still worshipping it like an idol. Historians still argue whether this story is a simple lesson in obedience or a deeper theological exploration of sin, judgment, and redemption. But for us, sitting here in the quiet, it's a perfect entry point into the paradoxical nature of heroes. Moses, the hero, the moral compass, is also the leader who presides over a situation where people are punished with a deadly plague of snakes. The solution isn't a warm, fuzzy act of pure good, it's a deeply unsettling, almost brutal, test of faith. You have to ask yourself, what kind of hero uses a symbol of death to grant life? It's a classic example of a good guy doing something that, from our modern perspective, feels incredibly wrong. It's the kind of complex, morally grey area we're going to be swimming in all night. He's a hero of faith, yes, but he's also a figure who operates under a moral code that we, in our soft, snake-free beds, can barely comprehend. We've left the dusty dunes of the desert, where snakes and salvation were two sides of the same bronze coin. Now, you're pulling on a leather breastplate, adjusting the weight of a short sword on your hip, and you're joining the ranks of a conquering army. You hear the rhythmic tramp of thousands of feet, the clang of bronze against shield, and you feel the raw energy of a young man leading you all. We're talking about Alexander the Great. When you hear his name, you probably think of a brilliant tactician, a visionary who carved out an empire stretching from Greece to India before he was even 33. His legacy is one of unparalleled military genius, of founding cities, and of spreading Hellenistic culture across the known world. He is the very definition of a great man of history. But in the long shadow of his colossal achievements, there are darker truths, and they speak to the moral paradox at the heart of so many of these heroes. Alexander's ambition wasn't just about glory, it was fueled by an insatiable hunger for power. And that hunger led to acts of incredible brutality. Think about his campaign against the Persian Empire. It wasn't a series of polite skirmishes, it was a brutal, no-holds-barred conquest. A mainstream historical fact is that during the Siege of Tyre, after the city resisted him fiercely, Alexander had thousands of its inhabitants crucified or sold into slavery. He was known for being merciless to those who defied him. And this wasn't a one-off event. It was a pattern of ruthless, strategic violence designed to send a message to any other city that dared to stand in his way. He wasn't just a military genius, he was a master of psychological warfare. And that often meant turning cities into charnel houses. Now, here's a quirky tidbit. Alexander was famously tutored by Aristotle, one of the greatest philosophers in history. Aristotle taught Alexander to appreciate the arts and sciences, but he also instructed him to treat the Greeks as free men and the barbarians, everyone else, as slaves. Alexander's worldview, a direct inheritance from his revered teacher, was built on a foundation of ethnic and cultural superiority. It's this very philosophy that made the crucifixion of the Tyrians or the sacking of other cities a morally acceptable act in his eyes. He wasn't conquering equals, he was civilizing a lesser people. At least in his own mind. You can almost hear him saying, "Hey, I'm just following my teacher's advice." It's a great example of how even the most enlightened minds of an era could hold views that we now find deeply abhorrent. This brings us to a part of the historical record that's often overlooked when we talk about Alexander's greatness, the people on the receiving end. Historians still argue whether Alexander's conquests truly fostered a more interconnected, cosmopolitan world or whether they simply served as a pretext for unimaginable violence and the destruction of local cultures. It's a classic chicken and egg problem. Did the spread of ideas justify the slaughter? Or was the slaughter simply a necessary evil for the spread of ideas? You can't separate the glory of his empire building from the immense suffering that made it possible. Consider the example of the Helots of Sparta. While Alexander was off conquering the world, the Spartans were still dealing with the Helots, a subjugated population who lived in a state of perpetual serfdom. Alexander's conquests didn't free people, they simply swapped one master for another. Often a much harsher one. The moral of this story isn't that Alexander was a bad guy and his enemies were good, it's that the very system he operated in, and the system he created, was built on the subjugation of others. The hero who brings enlightenment is also the tyrant who brings devastation. The glowing legacy of his empire is inextricably linked to the screams of those who died resisting it. You stand there in his army, seeing the cities burn, and you have to wonder, is this the price of greatness? Is this what it takes to be remembered for 1,000 years? It's a chilling thought to end our time here. We've left Alexander's burning cities behind, and now you're standing at the edge of a new battlefield. The damp, forested lands of ancient Gaul. The year is around 58 BCE, and you're a legionary, a veteran of a Roman army that moves with the cold, efficient precision of a well-oiled machine. Before you stands a figure whose name still echoes in history textbooks and on street signs, Julius Caesar. He's not the frail, assassinated senator of later years, but a vigorous, ambitious general, about to embark on a campaign that would make him the most powerful man in Rome. His military brilliance is undeniable. He's a master of logistics, siege warfare, and inspiring loyalty in his troops. He writes a book about it, too, the Commentaries on the Gallic War, which you've probably read a condensed version of in high school. It's a masterful piece of propaganda, a self-serving record of his heroic triumphs. But that's only one side of the story. The other side is written in blood and ashes. Caesar's Gallic campaigns, a mainstream historical fact, lasted for years and resulted in the conquest of a vast territory that is now modern-day France, Belgium, and parts of Germany. He won the war, yes, but at a staggering human cost. Historians estimate that up to 1 million Gauls were killed and another million were enslaved. That's a staggering number, representing a significant portion of the total population at the time. This wasn't just a war, it was a systematic campaign of destruction. A precursor to what we would now call genocide. Caesar wasn't just defending Rome's borders. As he claimed, he was conquering, enriching himself and his officers, and building a political base that would eventually allow him to seize total power. Here's a quirky tidbit. During the final siege of Alesia, Caesar's army was so efficient and his methods so ruthless that he built a series of circumvallations and contravallations, essentially two massive walls around the city. One wall kept the Gauls inside, and the other wall kept the Gallic relief army, a force of over 250,000 men, from getting in to help them. It was a brilliant, almost impossibly complex feat of engineering. Trapped between a Roman wall and a Roman army, the Gallic defenders were doomed. To add to the horror, the Gallic leader, Vercingetorix, tried to send non-combatants, women, children, and the elderly, out of the city to conserve food. Caesar simply refused them passage. He let him starve to death between the two walls, a brutal tactic that broke the morale of the defenders. It's an example of his cold, calculating genius, a genius that wasn't just about winning battles but about completely annihilating the will of his enemies to resist. Historians still argue whether Caesar's actions were a necessary evil for the creation of a more stable, Romanized Europe, or if they were the acts of a power-hungry warlord who was entirely indifferent to human suffering on a massive scale. There's no simple answer. The Romanization of Gaul brought roads, infrastructure, and a degree of stability that had not existed before. You can't deny the long-term benefits for the region, but those benefits came at the price of a culture and a people that were systematically wiped out. You stand there in Caesar's camp. Maybe you're eating your hardtack and sipping some watered-down wine, and you see the spoils of war being divided. You get a little extra money, maybe a new helmet. You feel the victory, but you also see the columns of captured Gauls, their faces grim, their fate uncertain. You have to ask yourself, did this hero, this brilliant general, bring civilization or just a more efficient form of barbarism? The lines are so incredibly blurred, so stained with the blood of the people he conquered, that it's impossible to see him as a pure hero. He is the paradox personified, the brilliant builder and the remorseless destroyer. All in one person. The scene shifts again, and now you're no longer a Roman legionary. You're a nomad on a windswept steppe. The vast grasslands of Central Asia stretching out to a horizon that seems to swallow the sky. You're on horseback, the wind whipping your hair, and you feel a sense of freedom that's as raw and untamed as the land itself. But this freedom is about to be organized, disciplined, and directed by a figure of almost mythical power and brutality, Genghis Khan. His name, for centuries, has been synonymous with conquest, with the thunder of hooves, and with a level of slaughter that is almost unimaginable. He's often seen as a force of nature, a harbinger of destruction who left a trail of ruined cities and shattered empires in his wake. However, as with all these figures, the story is more complicated than the simple narrative of a barbaric warlord. A mainstream historical fact is that Genghis Khan, whose birth name was Temujin, did not just conquer a vast amount of territory, he also unified the disparate, often warring, nomadic tribes of Mongolia into a single, cohesive nation. Before him, the steppes were a chaotic mess of feuding clans. He brought order, discipline, and a shared identity to a people who had never had one before. He was a nation builder of the first order, a man who saw the potential for greatness in his people and forged them into an unstoppable force. His legal code, the Yasa, established a framework for law and order that brought stability to a previously lawless land. But the flip side of this nation building was the terror he inflicted on those who resisted him. The Mongol conquests are famous for their brutality. Entire cities, like the magnificent Khwarezmian city of Samarkand, were utterly destroyed, their inhabitants slaughtered. The numbers are staggering, and the historical records, while sometimes exaggerated, paint a horrifying picture. It's a classic paradox. The man who brought peace and unity to his own people did so by bringing unimaginable war and devastation to countless others. Here's a quirky tidbit. The Mongol Empire under Genghis Khan, and later his successors, was a surprisingly tolerant place when it came to religion. As long as you paid your taxes and didn't resist, you were pretty much left alone to worship as you pleased. The Mongol capital of Karakoram had Buddhist, Muslim, Christian, and Taoist temples, all coexisting in a single city. Genghis himself seems to have been more interested in power and tribute than in religious conversion. This policy of religious tolerance was almost unheard of in a world where religious wars were common. It's a strange contradiction from a man who was so ruthless in every other aspect of his rule. Historians still argue whether Genghis Khan's primary motivation was the creation of a vast, interconnected economic and cultural zone, the so-called Pax Mongolica, that opened up the Silk Road to unprecedented levels of trade, or if he was simply a power-hungry conqueror who stumbled into creating that system as a byproduct of his insatiable ambition. The truth, of course, is probably a mix of both. The Mongol Empire's control of the Silk Road created a golden age of trade, where goods, technologies, and ideas flowed freely from east to west. Marco Polo and countless others benefited from the peace and stability that the Mongol control of the trade routes provided. But that peace was built on a foundation of fear, and it was maintained by the memory of what happened to those who dared to defy the Khan. You ride along, a member of his army, and you see a caravan of traders on one side, grateful for the protection of the Mongol patrols. On the other side, you see the smoldering ruins of a city that once resisted. You can't separate the two. The prosperity of the Silk Road is directly linked to the violence that made it possible. He is the great unifier, the great destroyer, and the great architect of a globalized world, all rolled into one. The paradox is as vast and as sweeping as the steppes themselves. We've left the great Mongol horde behind, trading the vast, cold steppes for the salty air and creaking timbers of a wooden ship. The year is 1492, and you're a sailor on the Santa Maria, feeling the endless rhythm of the ocean beneath your feet. The world you know is small, contained within the borders of Europe and a few tantalizing, distant lands, but you're sailing with a man who is about to change everything. A man whose name is now at the center of one of the most heated debates in all of history, Christopher Columbus. For generations, he was presented as an unqualified hero, a courageous visionary who, against all odds, proved the world was round and discovered a new continent. His bravery and navigational skills are undeniable. A mainstream historical fact is that his first voyage was a feat of extraordinary determination and courage, sailing into the unknown without a guarantee of ever returning. But this heroic narrative, this story of a plucky explorer, is now impossible to tell without confronting the devastating consequences of his arrival. The discovery was not an empty land, it was a world teeming with millions of people, vibrant cultures, and complex societies. Columbus's arrival wasn't the beginning of a new age of exploration for them, it was the beginning of the end. He and his men brought with them diseases to which the native populations had no immunity, and the subsequent plague and pestilence wiped out an estimated 90% of the indigenous peoples in the Americas. This wasn't an intentional act of genocide, but it was a catastrophic and unavoidable consequence of his voyage. And that's before we even get to the intentional acts of violence and oppression. Here's a quirky tidbit. Columbus's initial interactions with the Taino people of Hispaniola were documented in his own journal, and they reveal a deeply unsettling mindset. He wrote about their peaceful nature and generosity, noting that they ought to be good servants. He saw them not as people, but as a resource to be exploited. He quickly established a system of forced labor and tribute, demanding that every adult Taino bring him a certain amount of gold every 3 months. If they failed, he ordered their hands to be cut off. This wasn't a hero bringing civilization, it was a conqueror imposing a reign of terror. He also initiated the transatlantic slave trade, capturing and sending hundreds of Taino people back to Spain, many of whom died on the journey. Historians still argue whether Columbus should be seen as a courageous pioneer who opened up the world or as the progenitor of an era of unprecedented conquest, slavery, and cultural destruction. Can we separate his undeniable achievements in navigation from the horrors that followed in his wake? The very concept of Columbus Day is a flashpoint of this debate. For some, it's a celebration of a new world. For others, it's a day of mourning for the millions of lives lost and the cultures destroyed. You're on that ship, listening to the crew talk about the riches they'll find, the glory they'll bring back to Spain, but you also see the fear in the eyes of the native people who greet you. You see the beautiful, intricate golden ornaments they wear, and you see the avarice in the eyes of your fellow sailors. You understand, on a gut level, that this isn't just a voyage of discovery, it's a voyage of conquest. The heroic narrative feels a little hollow when you're standing on the other side of the gun. He is the brilliant mariner whose journey unleashed a tidal wave of death and destruction. And those two truths are forever intertwined. The creaking of the Santa Maria has faded, and now you're walking on solid ground again. But the air is thick with a different kind of tension. You're in a new world, a world of incredible contrasts, the sprawling, majestic city of Tenochtitlan, an island metropolis of canals and temples, glinting with gold and silver. It is one of the largest cities in the world at the time, more populous and cleaner than many European capitals, and at its heart stands the leader of a small but determined band of Spanish conquistadors, Hernán Cortés. He's not a king or an emperor, but a soldier of fortune, driven by a thirst for wealth and glory. He's the personification of the age of conquest, and his story is a microcosm of the clash between two worlds. His military campaigns were brilliant, audacious, and utterly ruthless. A mainstream historical fact is that with a force of only a few hundred men, a few horses, and some cannons, Cortés managed to topple the mighty Aztec Empire, a civilization that ruled over millions of people. His genius lay in his ability to exploit the internal politics of the region. He recognized that many of the city-states and tribes were tired of Aztec rule and the constant demand for tribute and sacrificial victims. He masterfully forged alliances with these disgruntled groups, most notably the Tlaxcalans, who became his crucial allies in the war against Tenochtitlan. His political maneuvering was as important as his military strategy. He wasn't just a conqueror, he was a master manipulator, a brilliant chess player who saw the entire board. But, as with Columbus, the story of his genius is inextricably linked with a level of unimaginable violence. The siege of Tenochtitlan was a brutal affair. lasting for months. When the city finally fell, it was not just a military defeat, it was a human catastrophe. The Spanish and their indigenous allies slaughtered a huge number of the city's inhabitants. The once magnificent city was razed to the ground, its temples and palaces destroyed to be replaced with Spanish churches and administrative buildings. The vast wealth of the Aztec Empire was plundered, and its people were subjected to a new kind of servitude. Here's a quirky tidbit. Cortés was incredibly good at keeping up appearances while simultaneously doing horrific things. For example, he brought a priest with him on his expedition, a man named Fray Bartolomé de Olmedo. This priest wasn't just there for spiritual comfort, he was there to provide a moral and religious justification for the conquest. The Spanish believed they were bringing Christianity to a pagan land, a mission that, in their minds, sanctioned any and all violence. It's a perfect example of a society using religion to legitimize its own rapacious desires. Cortés would often give grand speeches about his holy mission while his men were busy torturing and killing people for gold. Historians still argue whether Cortés's campaign was an inevitable clash of civilizations or if it was a singular act of hubris and greed that set a terrible precedent for the future of the Americas. Can we praise his strategic brilliance while condemning the moral vacuum in which he operated? He was undeniably a hero to his men and to the Spanish crown, securing a vast and wealthy territory that would make Spain a global superpower for centuries. But he was a figure of absolute terror and destruction to the people of the Aztec Empire. You are there in the smoking ruins, and you feel the elation of victory, the satisfaction of a campaign well executed. But you also see the destruction, the despair, and the casual cruelty. You know that the hero's triumph is built on a foundation of untold suffering. And you can't unsee it. The ruins of Tenochtitlan have been replaced by the cobbled streets of a new nation. And the air you're breathing is filled not with the smell of conquest but with the heady scent of revolution. You're standing in a Virginia plantation. The year is sometime in the late 18th century, and the sound of blacksmiths' hammers and the rustle of tobacco leaves are the soundtrack to your life. The man at the center of this new world is a figure you've always seen as the embodiment of American ideals, George Washington. He's the general who led the Continental Army to victory against the mighty British Empire. The calm and steady hand that guided the Constitutional Convention, and the first President of the United States. He's the very definition of a national hero, a man who, as the saying goes, could not tell a lie. But, as with all these heroic narratives, a closer look reveals a paradox that is both profound and deeply unsettling. A mainstream historical fact is that while Washington fought for the ideals of liberty and self-governance, he was also a lifelong slave owner. He inherited enslaved people at the age of 11. And he continued to own and profit from their labor for the rest of his life. His Mount Vernon plantation was a vast, complex operation, entirely dependent on the forced labor of hundreds of men, women, and children. The man who was the champion of freedom was also a master over human beings. It's a contradiction that is impossible to ignore. Here's a quirky tidbit. Washington was famously meticulous in his record keeping, and his financial ledgers and personal correspondence show a man who was deeply engaged in the business of slavery. He would track the market value of enslaved people, buy and sell them, and even chase after those who escaped. He was a savvy businessman who understood that his wealth and social standing were built on the backs of others. He also used a legal loophole to avoid freeing his slaves. A Pennsylvania law at the time stipulated that any slave who lived in the state for more than 6 months would be automatically freed. Washington, while president in Philadelphia, would rotate his enslaved staff out of the state every 6 months to prevent them from gaining their freedom. It's a chilling detail that shows a man who was willing to go to great lengths to uphold the institution of slavery, even as he was presiding over a nation founded on the idea of liberty. Historians still argue whether Washington's ownership of slaves was a product of his time, an accepted social and economic norm that he was simply born into, or whether his actions represented a fundamental betrayal of the very principles he helped to establish. Can you be a hero of liberty while denying it to others? This is the central, agonizing question of his legacy. The ideals of the American Revolution, all men are created equal, endowed with certain unalienable rights, are a direct result of his leadership. But the reality of his personal life, and the lives of those he enslaved, stands in stark contrast to those soaring words. You stand in the shadow of his great achievements, of a nation he helped to found. And you see the men and women who were not free, who built the very home he lived in. You realize that the foundations of this new republic were not built just on ideals and principles, but on the stolen labor and shattered dreams of human beings. The great hero of liberty is also a master of a system of oppression. He is the paradox of American history. And his legacy forces us to confront the uncomfortable truth that a person can be both great and deeply flawed at the same time. You've left the ideals and contradictions of the American Revolution behind. And now you're standing in a different kind of tumult. The late 18th and early 19th centuries are an era of seismic change. And the air is electric with the energy of a new kind of war. One fought not just for land but for ideas. You are a soldier in the Grand Army, a loyal footman to a man who, perhaps more than any other, embodies the paradox of a figure who brought both enlightenment and devastation. His name is Napoleon Bonaparte. He rose from obscurity to become the Emperor of France, a man whose ambition was as vast as the continent he sought to dominate. He's the brilliant military strategist who codified the law, but he's also the tireless warmonger who left a trail of millions of dead across Europe. A mainstream historical fact is that Napoleon's greatest domestic legacy is the Napoleonic Code, a system of laws that fundamentally reformed the French legal system and is still the basis of law in dozens of countries around the world. It was a revolutionary document that enshrined the principles of legal equality, property rights, and religious freedom. It dismantled the feudal relics of the old regime and created a modern, rational legal framework. He was, in this sense, a hero of reform and modernization. He brought a sense of order and fairness to a society that had been torn apart by revolution. His legal and administrative reforms were so effective that they were adopted and adapted far beyond the borders of France. He was a force for progress, a man who believed in the power of reason and the state. But this incredible legacy of reform is overshadowed by the staggering human cost of his reign. Here's a quirky tidbit. Napoleon was not just a military genius, he was a master of self-mythologizing. He cultivated an image of himself as a man of destiny, an unstoppable force, but behind that image were the cold, hard numbers of constant war. Historians estimate that the Napoleonic Wars resulted in the deaths of over 3 million soldiers and civilians. This wasn't just a few battles, it was nearly 2 decades of near-constant warfare. From the deserts of Egypt to the frozen plains of Russia, the very state he modernized was a war machine, constantly conscripting men, draining resources, and fighting for a level of dominance that was ultimately unsustainable. Historians still argue whether Napoleon's endless wars were a necessary evil to defend the French Revolution and its ideals from a coalition of reactionary monarchies, or if they were the product of a megalomaniacal emperor's insatiable lust for power. Did he fight to protect freedom? Or did he simply fight to protect his throne? You can look at the positive reforms, the Napoleonic Code, the rationalized administration, and see the hero, but you also have to look at the casualty lists, the fields of broken bodies, the ruined cities, and see the tyrant. He is a figure who forced the world to modernize, but he did so at an almost unimaginable cost. You're a soldier in his army, and you feel the fierce loyalty he inspires. You believe in his genius, his vision, but you also feel the cold of the Russian winter on your face, the hunger in your gut, and the fear of the next cannonball. You see the paradox in real time, a man who gave the world law and order with one hand and took away millions of lives with the other. The echo of Napoleon's cannons has faded, and now you're back on American soil, but a very different America from the one Washington knew. The year is 1863, and the nation is tearing itself apart. You're standing in a smoky, chaotic telegraph office, the air humming with the urgency of wartime communication. The man at the center of this maelstrom is Abraham Lincoln, a figure revered as the savior of the Union and the great emancipator. He is the president who, through his perseverance and political genius, kept the United States from fracturing and ultimately signed the Emancipation Proclamation. He's the hero who, against all odds, preserved the American experiment. But, as with all the figures we've encountered, Lincoln's heroism is not without its own dark and complicated aspects. A mainstream historical fact is that to win the Civil War, Lincoln took a series of unprecedented, and at times legally questionable, actions. He suspended the writ of habeas corpus, a fundamental legal protection that prevents the state from holding someone indefinitely without charge. He did this to suppress dissent and to imprison thousands of Confederate sympathizers and political opponents without trial. He ordered the blockade of southern ports without congressional approval, and he censored newspapers and imprisoned journalists who were critical of the war effort. These were acts of a wartime leader. Yes, but they were also the acts of a man willing to push the boundaries of constitutional power to achieve his goals. Here's a quirky tidbit. Lincoln was a master of political maneuvering, and he wasn't afraid to use humor, and even sarcasm, to get his point across. He had a razor-sharp wit and a knack for telling a good story, often using these anecdotes to disarm his opponents or to illustrate a complex point. But his political genius also had a ruthless side. For example, he fired a series of generals who he felt were too slow or ineffective. He was impatient and, when he felt it was necessary, was perfectly willing to be brutal in his pursuit of victory. He was not a man who suffered fools gladly, and he was not above using every political and military tool at his disposal to win the war, even if those tools bent or broke the rules. Historians still argue whether Lincoln's actions were a necessary evil, a set of pragmatic choices made to save the Union, or if they represented a dangerous precedent for the expansion of presidential power in times of crisis. Can we praise him for preserving the nation while also acknowledging that he did so by temporarily eroding some of its founding principles? The Emancipation Proclamation itself is a perfect example of this paradox. It was a moral declaration that freed millions of people, but it was also a strategic military move designed to weaken the Confederacy by inciting slave revolts and giving a moral purpose to the war. It didn't free the enslaved people in the border states that remained loyal to the Union, it only applied to the states in rebellion. It was an act of both great moral courage and great political calculation. You stand in that telegraph office, and you feel the weight of his decisions. You see a man who is both a principled idealist and a ruthless pragmatist. The hero who saved the Union is also the man who used authoritarian means to do so. It's a paradox that forces you to confront the difficult choices that leaders must make in times of war. And it reminds you that the road to salvation is often paved with moral compromise. The echoes of the American Civil War are fading, replaced by the ominous drumbeat of a new global conflict. The year is 1940, and you're huddled in a cramped, bomb-proof bunker, listening to the wail of air raid sirens and the distant thud of explosions. The world is on the brink of collapse, and the only thing standing against the seemingly unstoppable tide of Nazi Germany is a man whose voice, a booming mix of defiance and cigar smoke, has become a symbol of unyielding resistance. His name is Winston Churchill. He is a mainstream historical fact, revered as the Lion of Britain, the Prime Minister who rallied his nation and the free world to fight against tyranny. His speeches, full of soaring rhetoric about fighting on the beaches and never surrendering, are masterpieces of wartime leadership. He is a hero of the highest order, the man who, for many, saved Western civilization. But as with all these figures, his heroism is far from pure. Churchill was a product of the British Empire, a system of colonial rule that, even in his lifetime, was coming under increasing scrutiny. He was an unapologetic imperialist, a man who believed in the inherent superiority of the British and saw the empire as a force for good. Here's a quirky tidbit. During the Bengal famine of 1943, a catastrophic event that killed millions of people, Churchill's response was not one of empathy and aid. He was dismissive, once allegedly blaming the famine on the Indians themselves, saying they breed like rabbits. He refused to divert aid, and his policies have been criticized by historians as contributing to the severity of the famine. It's a chilling reminder that the man who fought for freedom in Europe was, at the same time, presiding over an empire that denied freedom to millions of people in Asia and Africa. Historians still argue whether Churchill's colonial policies were simply a product of their time, a regrettable but understandable part of a bygone era, or if they represented a fundamental moral failing that tarnishes his heroic reputation. Can you be a hero of liberty in one part of the world while simultaneously being a champion of oppression in another? The paradox is a difficult one to reconcile. The courage he showed in standing up to Hitler is undeniable. The moral blindness he displayed in his colonial attitudes is equally undeniable. You stand in that bunker, feeling the tremors of the bombs, and you hear his voice on the radio, full of strength and purpose. You feel a sense of hope and defiance, but you also know about the famine, about the millions of people who were not saved by his policies, but died under his watch. The man who saved the world from one form of tyranny was also a staunch defender of another. The specter of war still hangs in the air, but the battlefields have changed. The conflicts of nations have given way to the conflicts of science and conscience. And now you're standing in a different kind of bunker, a laboratory in the New Mexico desert. The year is 1945, and the world is holding its breath. The man at the center of this new maelstrom is J. Robert Oppenheimer, the brilliant physicist who led the Manhattan Project, the top-secret effort to build the world's first atomic bomb. He is a mainstream historical fact, hailed as a hero of science and a patriot who gave his nation the weapon that ended World War II. His genius is undeniable, his leadership a feat of extraordinary scientific and administrative coordination. He is the father of the atomic age, the man whose work changed the very nature of human conflict. But his heroism is a deeply tragic one, a story of a man whose great achievement became his greatest source of regret. Here's a quirky tidbit. Oppenheimer was a man of wide-ranging interests, fluent in multiple languages, and deeply knowledgeable about poetry, philosophy, and Eastern spirituality. It was this interest in ancient Sanskrit texts that led him to quote a line from the Bhagavad Gita after the first successful atomic test: "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." This wasn't a triumphant boast, it was a moment of profound, almost religious, terror. He understood, in a way that perhaps no one else could, the true implications of what he had unleashed. The hero who built the bomb was also the man who felt the crushing weight of its moral consequences. Historians still argue whether Oppenheimer's post-war moral awakening was genuine or if it was simply a response to the political backlash he faced. Can you be a hero for building a weapon that saved lives by ending a war, while also being the person who is haunted by the hundreds of thousands of lives that weapon took? The paradox of Oppenheimer is not about what he did but about what he became. He was the brilliant scientist who, in a moment of crisis, gave his nation a decisive tool, but he was also the man who, for the rest of his life, campaigned for international arms control and spoke out against the very weapons he helped to create. He was a hero who came to see himself as a villain, or at least a deeply compromised figure. You stand in that lab, and you see the flickering lights and the complex equations on the blackboard. You feel the buzz of 1,000 minds working towards a single goal. But you also feel the cold dread of what that goal means. The triumph of science is a triumph of humanity, but in this case, it was a triumph that came at a terrifying price. And Oppenheimer was the man who had to pay it. The moral calculus of the atomic age is a heavy burden, and now we move from the stark black and white of science and war to a different kind of heroism. One built not on power, but on the power of the powerless. You're in a different land, a different time. The arid landscapes of colonial India in the early 20th century. You're with a crowd of people, all of you walking together in quiet, determined protest, not with weapons, but with the simple demand for justice. The man leading this movement is a small, frail figure with a powerful gaze, Mahatma Gandhi. He is a mainstream historical fact, a global icon of peaceful resistance, a hero whose philosophy of satyagraha, or truth force, inspired civil rights movements around the world. He led India to independence without firing a single shot, a feat of political and moral courage that is almost unparalleled in human history. But as with all these figures, his personal life and beliefs were far more complicated and, at times, deeply troubling. Here's a quirky tidbit: Gandhi's asceticism and his commitment to non-violence were legendary. But they were also a source of great personal turmoil for those around him. He experimented with his own sexuality and his ideas of celibacy in ways that many would now find deeply inappropriate and unsettling. He slept with young women and girls, including his own grandniece, as a way to test his own commitment to celibacy. He insisted that these were spiritual exercises, not sexual ones, but the power dynamics involved and the potential for abuse are impossible to ignore. It's a side of his life that is often glossed over in the heroic narrative. But it reveals a man who, in his pursuit of spiritual purity, could be a tyrant to those closest to him. Historians still argue whether Gandhi's personal flaws and controversial beliefs should be seen as separate from his political achievements or if they are so intertwined that we must reassess his entire legacy. Can you be a hero for millions while being a difficult, even harmful, figure to the people in your own life? He was a champion of the oppressed, a man who fought against the brutal caste system in India and the racism of the British Empire. But he also held views on race that, at times, were deeply prejudiced. Early in his life, he expressed contempt for black Africans, calling them Kafirs and arguing for the superiority of Indians. He later changed his views, but the early prejudices are a stain on his record. You are in that crowd, walking with him, feeling the power of his message and the rightness of the cause. But you also hear the whispers, the stories about his personal life, and you are forced to reconcile the two. The great hero of non-violence is also a flawed, deeply human figure who, in his quest for spiritual perfection, could be a source of great pain and discomfort to those around him. We've moved from India, from the spiritual and political complexity of Gandhi, to a different kind of struggle, one on the streets and in the pulpits of mid-20th century America. You're standing in a church, the air thick with the power of a speech, the words of a man whose voice you know from 1,000 documentaries and history lessons. His name is Martin Luther King Jr., and he is a mainstream historical fact. The unquestioned hero of the American civil rights movement. He is the man who marched for justice, who dreamed of a world where people were judged not by the color of their skin but by the content of their character. His philosophy of nonviolent resistance, inspired by Gandhi, brought about seismic social change and shattered the legal edifice of segregation. He is, for many, a figure of almost saint-like purity and moral rectitude. But, as with Gandhi, the man behind the public persona was far more complex and, at times, deeply flawed. Here's a quirky tidbit. Martin Luther King Jr. was a human being with human frailties. And his personal life was a source of great concern for the FBI, which was, under J. Edgar Hoover, obsessed with discrediting him. The FBI bugged his hotel rooms and documented his extramarital affairs, which they then tried to use to blackmail and discredit him. While the FBI's actions were a reprehensible abuse of power, they revealed a side of King's life that stood in stark contrast to his public image as a morally pure leader. It's a classic example of the tension between the public hero and the private man. And it forces us to confront the fact that a person can do great things while still being a deeply imperfect human being. Historians still argue whether King's personal transgressions diminish his public achievements or if they are simply a part of a larger, more complicated story of a man under immense pressure. Can we separate the moral power of the "I have a dream" speech from the personal struggles of the man who delivered it? The paradox of King is that he was a man who preached a message of love and righteousness. But he was also a man who had his own personal demons. He was a brilliant strategist who knew how to use the media and the political system to his advantage. He wasn't just a dreamer, he was a canny and pragmatic politician who understood the power of an image and a well-timed protest. You stand in that church, and you feel the raw power of his words, the sense of moral purpose he gives to the movement. But you also know about the other stuff, the uncomfortable truths that the textbooks often leave out. The hero of the civil rights movement is also a reminder that great moral achievements can be made by deeply flawed individuals. We've traveled through time, from the prophets of ancient deserts to the civil rights leaders of the modern era. And now we arrive at a final figure, one who, perhaps more than any other, embodies the paradox of heroism in the modern world. You're standing in a South African prison cell on Robben Island. The damp, salty air a constant reminder of your captivity. The year is 1982, and the man you're with has been here for decades. A political prisoner, a revolutionary, a symbol of resistance against the brutal system of apartheid. His name is Nelson Mandela. He is a mainstream historical fact, revered as the father of modern South Africa. A man who, after 27 years in prison, emerged not with bitterness and a lust for revenge, but with a message of reconciliation and forgiveness. He became the first democratically elected president of his country, a hero of liberation who brought a fractured nation back from the brink of civil war. But the path to that heroic stature was a long and morally complicated one. Here's a quirky tidbit. Before he became the global symbol of peaceful resistance, Mandela was a revolutionary who co-founded the armed wing of the African National Congress, the Umkhonto we Sitzwe, Spear of the Nation. He was a military leader who advocated for and oversaw acts of sabotage against the apartheid government. He wasn't a Gandhi, a man who believed in non-violence as an absolute principle. He was a pragmatist who, when he felt that peaceful protest had failed, was willing to turn to violence as a last resort. He was a hero, but a hero who was also a rebel, a man who was willing to fight fire with fire to achieve his goals. Historians still argue whether Mandela's embrace of violence was a necessary and justifiable response to the oppression of apartheid or if it was a regrettable turn away from the moral high ground of non-violent resistance. Can you be a symbol of peace and reconciliation while also being a man who once sanctioned violence? The paradox of Mandela is that his greatest triumph was his ability to transcend his own history. The man who came out of prison was a very different man from the one who went in. He was a man who, through his own journey, came to believe that true power lay not in revenge, but in forgiveness. But he also knew that the threat of violence was what gave him leverage in the negotiations to end apartheid. He was a hero of peace, but one whose path was forged in the fire of armed struggle. You're standing in that prison cell, and you see the strength in his eyes, the unwavering belief in a free South Africa. But you also know about the years of rebellion, the bombs and the explosions that he helped to orchestrate. He is a hero whose legacy forces us to confront the difficult, often morally compromised, choices that leaders must make to bring about change. We've completed our long journey, stepping through the desert dust of ancient lawgivers, across the bloody battlefields of conquering generals, and into the complex moral landscapes of modern leaders. You've seen the bronze serpent, the burning cities, the enslaved people, the endless wars, and the moral compromises that stained the legacies of those we call heroes. You've been a witness to the paradox, the unsettling truth that the great architects of history were also, almost without exception, deeply flawed human beings. They were men and women who, in their quest for greatness, for justice, for a better world, often perpetrated acts that, from our modern vantage point, seem unforgivable. But the question remains, and it's a question you must now carry with you: how do we, as a society, grapple with these figures? How do we hold two seemingly contradictory truths in our minds at the same time? A mainstream historical fact is that our understanding of these figures is constantly in flux. Statues are erected and then torn down. Textbooks are rewritten. The heroes of one generation become the villains of the next. The very act of historical inquiry is a continuous process of reassessment and re-evaluation. We are in a constant dialogue with our past, and that dialogue is often uncomfortable and contentious. Here's a quirky tidbit. The Roman historian Tacitus once wrote that, "It is human nature to hate the man whom you have wronged." It's a cynical view, but it speaks to a deeper truth about power and justification. The people who are doing the conquering, the enslaving, the destroying, often have to hate their victims to justify their actions. They have to dehumanize them, to see them not as people but as obstacles to their own glory. This mindset, this cognitive dissonance, is a key part of the paradoxical hero. They have to believe in the righteousness of their cause so fiercely that they can't see the suffering they are causing. Historians still argue whether we should judge historical figures by the moral standards of their own time or by the universal ethical principles that we now hold to be self-evident. There is no simple answer. Judging them by their own standards risks excusing atrocities, while judging them by ours risks falling into a kind of moral anachronism, where we condemn people who couldn't have known better. The answer, of course, lies somewhere in the middle. We must understand the context in which they lived, but we must also never forget the consequences of their actions. We must hold both truths in our minds at the same time. The paradoxical hero is not a figure to be celebrated or condemned in simple terms, but a figure to be understood in all their complex, contradictory glory. The sun is setting on our journey, and the shadows are getting longer. The question isn't whether there are pure heroes in history. We've seen, time and again, that there aren't. The real question is how we choose to remember and learn from the flawed heroes we do have. Do we whitewash their pasts, creating a comfortable but ultimately dishonest narrative? Or do we confront the difficult truths, holding both the glory and the gore in our hands? The answer, I think, lies in the latter. We have to look at these figures, not as statues on a pedestal, but as complex human beings who made choices, some good, some terrible, that shaped the world we live in today. And in doing so, we learn a little more about ourselves. Now, let the hum of the fan, the soft sound of your own breathing, ease into the silence. The historical figures we've explored tonight, with their triumphs and their flaws, are no longer marching through your mind. They've laid down their swords and their burdens. The dusty deserts and the thundering battlefields have receded into the quiet, dark corners of the past. There's no more need to pass the contradictions, to weigh the good against the bad. That work is done for tonight. You can let the complicated truths of history settle into a quiet, calm place within you. Feel the weight of the blanket, the softness of the pillow. The journey is over, and the only thing left to do is to rest. Just for a moment, let go of the names, the dates, the battles. The world of history is a vast and challenging place. But for now, it can wait. It will still be there in the morning, with all its beautiful, terrible, and paradoxical stories. For now, it's just you and the quiet. Breathe deeply, slowly. Feel the tension leaving your body, your mind unwinding like a loose thread. There is only this moment, this stillness, this gentle fade into sleep.